This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold, and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again, and thou be conscience calmed. See, here it is, I hold it towards you. Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn. This is a slightly different episode than usual. At the time of recording, Halloween is just 2 days away for 2025. And if you've been with this podcast for some time, you know that I love a good Halloween episode. To that end, I've resurrected a poem from my very first Halloween special back in 2020. I've gone over the original script and brought some new chilling insights to it for you to enjoy. Few words can encapsulate a sense of dread and ominous end as well as this poem. This is The Living Hand by John Keats. It is a masterwork in short but lasting fear. Fitting for the time of year that it is, this poem is a kind of enigma. It was found scribbled on the pages of another unfinished work. As noted Keats scholar Jack Stillinger wrote, the poem was drafted or copied on the outside recto of a folded sheet on which, after turning it over and around, Keats drafted stanzas 45 to 51 of the Jealousies. This poem didn't even manage to get published until 1898, a full 77 years after Keats shuffled off his own mortal coil. In that sense, John Keats really is reaching towards us, the reader, from beyond the grave. It invokes a very macabre version of life imitating art. To reinforce that sense of the grave, this poem was written towards the end of John Keats' rather short life. As a romantic poet, he rose to prominence in his early career for his mastery of poetic form and unique turn of phrase. He set himself apart from many of his contemporaries through his focus not only on the beauty and majesty of life and nature, but on the absence of it as well. Many romantic poets were dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure and aesthetic joy. These took the form of poems that waxed lyrical about the joys of life and the majesty of the natural world. Often, those poems that exalted those virtues loudest have become a source of mockery, many seeing them as hollow and a little empty on occasion. But Keats was convinced that in order to understand what it is to be human and to make great art, darkness had to be embraced as much as the light. His own words put this best in a letter that he wrote in 1818. The world is full of misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness, and oppression, whereby this chamber of maiden thought becomes gradually darkened, and at the same time, on all sides of it, many doors are set open, but all dark, all leading to dark passages. We see not the balance of good and evil. We are in a mist. We feel the burden of mystery. Those words seem almost too perfect for a Halloween episode, but the quote, and indeed this poem, are a testament to how dark Keats could truly get when writing poetry. It is not only the circumstances surrounding its writing, but Keats' spectacularly vivid use of description in the poem that put a chill up our spines. We can almost feel the decay he is describing seep into our own bones as we listen. Just take the first half of the poem. This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold, and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights. There is an immense sense of the uncanny, the strange, and the eerie in that singular image of a hand. It is disembodied within the poem. Our speaker lends no detail to whom it belongs. Perhaps it is the illogical contrast of imagery in the poem between warm and capable flesh and the icy tomb that makes us so uneasy. There is the hanging possibility of, if it were cold, that feels like an omen or an augur of something terrible to come. The speaker is living and breathing now, but it feels as though that may not last. In reality, the warm hand here is more than likely Keats's own, whereas the cold one is a reference to the death that is awaiting him. The language in this brief poem is laced with the duality I mentioned earlier. Warm, cold, living, tomb, days, nights, dry, stream. There is a continuous, terrifying balance between life and death as we read on. The hand shifts from one state to the next as the poem progresses, taking on a much more sinister form. The spectre of death is embodied by that hand, constantly reminding Keats of his fate, haunting his own days and dreaming. However, keen readers will notice that Keats shifts his focus from the hand to his audience. So haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights. Suddenly, the threat of this hand is immediate, and it's not aimed at Keats. Instead, it's aimed directly at thou, at you, the reader or the listener. From here, a very strange bargain is offered in the second half. That thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again. And thou be conscience calmed, see here it is, I hold it towards you. To understand the ritual being invoked, we must understand Keats's final days. I borrow liberally from John E. Walsh's book, Darkling, I Listen, to paint you this picture. John Keats endured what he described as slow agony in Rome during his final days. They were marked by a severe physical decline and intense mental torment. It began on December 9th, 1820, with a violent coughing fit that produced near 2 cupfuls of blood, which he calmly declared his death. To stem the bleeding, he was placed on a near-starvation diet, which caused him to constantly cry out from gnawing hunger, compounded by fevered sweating and ceaseless painful coughing. Beyond his physical suffering, his mind was plagued by despair in every shape. His memory and imagination presented every image in horror. He experienced a profound sense of existential detachment, lamenting that his life felt like a posthumous existence, and that he was no longer dying into life, but into death, the death that is extinction. In other words, his final days felt like a state of continuous death that living had fled long ago. With this horrific context, it is not hard to see why the lines of this living hand seem so portentous. The preoccupation with husked hearts and dry veins also makes more sense now. This poem is a portrait of complete bodily collapse. Keats wasn't just writing about a theoretical icy silence of the tomb. He was living it. His own body had betrayed him, becoming a source of horror and pain. It was, as he said, a posthumous existence, where his mind was trapped in a decaying vessel. This lived experience of body horror, the blood, the starvation, and the fever, is the furnace that forged this poem. It is also no surprise, then, that he would wish to swap places with literally anyone else. With this reading in mind, it feels as though the reader is being begged to take part in some kind of transfer of life force. In his own words, "Wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again." Far from being an appeal for pity, Keats seems confident that anyone who saw him in his dying state would strike this bargain willingly. The poem takes on new layers of meaning. If the reader were to see Keats' icy hand, they would be haunted by Keats' decline, his lack of vigour, his dwindling gift of poetry. And if they did not intervene, they would be riddled with guilt for it. He is so certain that you would be haunted that he frames the transfusion as a gift almost, to reanimate his cold hand and so be conscience calmed. That idea of transfusion unlocks the poem's almost vampiric mechanism. The earnest grasping described in the first half takes on a more sinister feel. Keats is desperately seeking resurrection. It's worth noting that this revivification is metaphorical for his writing and career too. At the time of his death, his star had dwindled somewhat. He famously stated in an 1820 letter to longtime friend Fanny Braun, "If I should die, I have left no immortal work behind me, nothing to make my friends proud of my memory. But I have loved the principle of beauty in all things, and if I had had time, I would have made myself remembered." As it turns out, his fears were totally unfounded when it came to being remembered. Be that as it may, we can imagine that his need to be remembered was compounded into a kind of desperation by the dire circumstances of his final days. It is that need to endure and press himself into the minds of many that is yet another drive to connect with the reader. He wants our life force, but more than that, he wants to be remembered. The poem leaps into the present with its final lines. "See, here it is, I hold it towards you." Keats reaches out to us with his dark invitation. On the one hand, pun very much intended, he invites us to take in his poetry again, to remember him as the literary force he was. On the other hand, he asks us to give ourselves so that his own red life might stream again. It is difficult not to imagine the likes of Bram Stoker or Edgar Allan Poe taking macabre inspiration from the living hand many years later. It is a poem that is undeniably gothic, horrific, and vampiric in equal measure. The sense of atmosphere around dried hearts and streaming veins in icy tombs lingers with us as readers. The dire nature of John Keats' final bargaining are made all the worse by his desperation to be remembered, to have his work immortalized. In this poem, he seeks that immortality on a surface level through a strange and eerie transfusion. On a metaphorical level, however, he seeks immortality through your reading of his words. It is strange to think that John Keats may never have known the length and breadth of his influence centuries later. That podcasts like this would still be made, reciting his poetry to whoever would listen. In the end, though, it simply proves that fear in the face of death can come for us all. Even a legend of poetry like John Keats. I hope you enjoyed this slightly darker episode of Words That Burn. If you're interested in more Halloween poetry, I've linked a few of the older Words That Burn Halloween specials below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following the podcast wherever you're listening, or even better, sending this poem to a friend who enjoys John Keats, and help and let him achieve just a little more of the immortality he was seeking. If you'd like to read the script for this episode of Words That Burn, complete with citations, you can check it out below at the Substack link in the description. Feel free to follow along with the podcast and suggest any poems that you would like to hear in the future. Thank you once again for listening to Words That Burn. I wish you a very, very happy Halloween,